wisdom literature is such a unique genre in the Old Testament, and I don't think that we've ever really done a good job equipping folks with how to read that genre. Um, and for some, they just think that means Proverbs, which of course it is not. It's much bigger than that. Um, and so I thought it would be good to take some time to sort of look at this genre in the Old Testament that can give us a little more, well, just make it a little bit easier for us when it comes time to reading. We read more intelligently, right? I mean, that's what we always hope, is that we're reading the Bible better in all that we're doing. So we're going to look at wisdom literature tonight. We're going to just do an introduction. So it may be brief, it may be longer. I don't know for sure. We'll see how it goes. The Hebrew word wisdom, chokhmah, is a word that we normally associate wisdom with mental capacity or intelligence, but chokhmah is a word that can be used of skills like smithing or carpentry or any kind of craftsman or artwork. It's a word that goes beyond just intellect. It usually is thought of as learning how to live well. That's wisdom literature, living in this world well. Um, Wisdom is not indigenous only to Palestine. Um, it's actually everywhere. The wisdom writings that we have in the Old Testament are located in the writings section of the. It is in the writings section of the Hebrew Bible. The Ketubim, which I've often joked is the sort of the Hebrew word for miscellaneous. You have Torah, which is Genesis to Deuteronomy. You have prophets, which is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then the the, the major prophets and the Book of the 12. And then you have everything that's not Torah or prophets. And so Psalms goes in there, songs, Job, Proverbs, Chronicles, Daniel, all of that is in the writing section of the Hebrew canon. What's unique about wisdom literature, and I think this is what is so important to remember when interpreting it, wisdom literature is indirect revelation. And while I absolutely am comfortable with saying that the divine has a hand in the canonical process and shaping the canon, that the Bible is what God would have us to have, um, the text itself is indirect revelation. What I mean by that is the prophets, you get direct revelation. In the prophets, you get, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel," and they say it to the prophet, and the prophet says to the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel." Proverbs is not like that. Proverbs is observing the world, seeing how the world works according to certain rules, and making judgments based on how the world works. And so it is believing that God created this world and universe to conform to certain patterns and certain ways of working, and that you can glean something of that in the observing the world. I've always found it interesting that astrology is so condemned by the Old Testament. Astrology is always seen as witchcraft and soothsaying. Yet Zoroastrianism, relevant because of our recent magi's, um, they were obviously astrologers, or they wouldn't have cared about the star that appeared to them. Um, and their belief was that the chief god of the Zoroastrian pantheon, Ahura Mazda, placed the stars and planets where uh, that god wanted them to be, and that by observing where the planets and stars were, you could somehow infer something of the will of Ahura Mazda. Well, I think on some level, Judaism would resonate with that. That they would believe Yahweh created the universe and that Yahweh placed the stars and planets where they wanted to be. But astrology roundly condemned that you can't observe or know anything from observing the universe. But they did believe you could observe the world and how it worked and how it functioned. And I mean that in the broadest possible terms. Early to bed, early to rise makes one happy, healthy, and wise. And a penny saved is a penny earned. And these bits of information that you glean from living life, that for me always came from my grandfather. I don't know who was the chief idiom spinner in your life, but in mine it was my grandfather. Um, for the reason that because they're observing the world and seeing how it functions, it's often connected with what's known as creation theology. Creation theology is sort of a broad term that includes a lot of things, but that um, just to sort of, in a nutshell, creation theology believes that God creates, humanity corrupts, God recreates, and that the story of the Old Testament is that story happening over and over and over again. You would probably contrast that with covenant theology, which is that God establishes covenant with humanity, and that humanity breaks that covenant, and then God must restore that covenant, which is the more dominant narrative actually through in the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. Creation theology really started to become popular in the 1970s and sort of interprets everything through the eyes of creation. So wisdom sort of falls into that because it's observing the world and assuming that the world works according to certain rules, if you will. As I said, Israel is not the only people to look at the world. Everyone is looking at the world. Everybody's grandfather had wisdom, perhaps. I don't know. But everybody is living in the same world. And it doesn't take being from Israel to know that if you get up early, you have an advantage over the people that are sleeping late. Or that anger's something that can get out of control, or that you probably shouldn't take advantage of the widow or the orphan. I mean, those are things that pretty much you can figure out if you're a human being. So Israel's sages, and that's the shorthand I'm going to use for the people who are writing wisdom literature, Israel's sages never hesitated to borrow from any of the traditions that surrounded them. In fact, many of the most beloved wisdom traditions that you're aware of have origins very likely outside of Israel. The story of Job almost certainly is taking place outside. All the characters are non-Israelite. And Proverbs 31, the wise woman passage that everyone loves, is written by a king who is not, his name doesn't occur in any king list, in any Israelite king list. So he's non-Israelite king giving us that. Yes, everyone has a wisdom tradition. I mean, and the way that Proverbs comes together, it seems to be a compendium of wisdom from all over the place. So while there are scholars who will say wisdom seems to have its origin in, I am not one of those people. I think wisdom seems to have its origin in being a human being and living in the world and having the time to write some of that stuff down. So yeah, I wouldn't put it in any particular place. Now, I said Israel never hesitated to borrow from those other traditions around them. But when they did, the sages always fixed the material theologically, right? So if you've got a wisdom song that is celebrating the god Amun in Egypt, then you global search and replace Amun with Yahweh, and boom, now you've got a wisdom literature for Yahweh. We're going to see one place where they did this explicitly in just a second, and so you'll see what I'm saying. But yeah, sages always wanted to sort of make sure it fit within Orthodox theology, and so they fixed that material whenever they borrowed it. This is what I was mentioning earlier. Several proverbs in the section from Proverbs 22:17 to 24:22 parallel very closely the instruction of Amenemope. Amenemope is an Egyptian wisdom document, and it was noticed that there are a lot of connections between Proverbs 22 to 24 and this wisdom section from Egypt. So let me show you what that looks like. So this is Proverbs. Incline thine ear, hear the words of the wise, apply thine heart to my doctrine, for it's pleasant if thou keep them in thy belly, that they may be established together upon thy lips. Amenemope in chapter 1 says, give thine ear, hear what I say, apply thine heart to apprehend it. It is good for thee to place them in thine heart. Let them rest in the casket of thy belly, that they may act as a peg upon thy tongue. Well, that's almost exactly the same way of expressing that. And then you get some of the Proverbs as you go down through the documents. Rob not the poor from the Bible. Rob not the poor, for he is poor. Neither oppress or crush the lowly in the gate. The Egyptian text, beware of robbing the poor and oppressing the afflicted. Proverbs 22:24-5. Do not befriend the man of anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest thou learn his ways and take a snare for thy soul. Amenemope, associate not with the passionate man, nor approach him for conversation. Leap not to cleave to such an one. That terror carry thee not away. These are obviously somewhat obscure translations, older translations. If you see a man quick in his work, before kings he will stand, before cravens he will not stand. A scribe who is skillful in his business findeth worthy to be a courtier. When thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee, and put a knife to thy throat, if thou be a man given to appetite. So if the king gives you a lot of stuff, you're killing yourself if you eat all this stuff. You gotta don't go for everything. Same thing here. Eat not bread in the presence of a ruler. Lunge not forward with thy mouth before a governor. So show some restraint if you're with a leader. Same text. Toil not to become rich. Cease from dishonest gain. Toil not after riches. If stolen goods are brought to thee. Remove not the widows. These are just all examples. Remove not the widow's landmark. So you can see I'm just going through Proverbs and going through Amenemope, and the parallels are similar because this one goes back in time here. Remove not the landmark from the boundaries of the field. Violate not the widow's boundary. So you see all these connections between this. And so it was not uncommon. And this is one of those facts that for some reason it caused heartburn to a lot of my students. They felt like, I don't know, the biblical text was plagiarizing or something. I don't know what it was that was bothering them, but it just isn't a surprise to me that Israel would be a part of the world that it was living in, that it would be aware of what people around it would say, and that sometimes when those people had good ideas, they would take them and report them. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a real, to me, it doesn't trouble me, I guess. I suppose if you want Solomon to write all of them, then it's a problem. But even the book of Proverbs doesn't say Solomon wrote all of them, but tradition always has. And so maybe that's what causes people some stress or heartburn on that. But for me, I've been to enough churches where the pastor has taken a sermon illustration from Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or a Marvel movie enough to know that if we, when we are trying to bring the truth, are aware of our surroundings and any good truth that might come from it, then it shouldn't surprise us that Israel was as well. So two kinds of wisdom. Practical wisdom is the wisdom that everybody thinks of when I say wisdom literature in the Old Testament, right? That is Proverbs. That is the pithy sayings that have been boiled down to bumper sticker kind of things that you would expect. Look before you leap. He who hesitates is lost. Penny saved is penny earned. That kind of that is practical wisdom. The one example we have of that in the Old Testament is Proverbs. However, if you grew up Catholic or you happen to have a Catholic canon, Sirach, which is sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, is also an example of practical wisdom. Which actually, it's a much bigger book. If I remember right, it's like 48 chapters. A couple of really cool things. It's actually The Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach is the title of it. And I had a Bible. It was when we were at College Avenue in Laurel, and I had this beautiful black Bible that had Apocrypha in it, and it had it in the middle. A lot of Apocryphas are at the end, but this one was at the middle so it was between the Old and New Testament. So it was a Sunday night Bible study or something. The pastor was asking something, and I go to flip for the book, and of course it opens to the middle, and it opens to Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach. And someone sitting with, I don't have the Wisdom of Jesus in my Bible. What Bible is that you have there? So I had to confess I had a Catholic Bible, which had this in it. 48 chapters. Honestly, a lot funnier than Proverbs. There's a lot more to me that jokes about it. One of the greatest things about it, there's a a prologue to the book of Ecclesiasticus, because what we have, or Sirach, what we have is the translation his grandson did of it. And in the prologue, his grandson writes, these are the, translating, and he says in it, unfortunately, taking Hebrew into Greek doesn't go real well sometimes. So you're going to have to forgive the place where it just doesn't have the same impact as it does in the original. It's like this awareness of the limitations of translation in the 2nd century BC, as he's talking about, it's not as beautiful as the Hebrew. It's just not, but what are you going to do? Nobody can read it. But he also is the first person to give us the law and the prophets as sections. So that kind of gives us some canonical markers there. But anyway, anyone who tries to teach a fool wastes their time. At the end of the day, he just says, what is it? One of my favorites from Sirach: sand, salt, and a piece of iron are easier to bear than a stupid person. So, amen. Yeah, exactly. The man can preach. And I really love this. This is like my favorite non-biblical verse is in Sirach. Strive for the truth unto death, and the Lord your God will not forget you. Like, that's a great verse. If you skip past the misogyny, it's really a very good book. It really is. So, yeah. So yeah, good. It's really a fun book. It's big, but it's fun. The other, so these are your basic what you think of with wisdom stuff. The other kind of wisdom is skeptical wisdom. Skeptical wisdom is Job and Ecclesiastes, or you'll hear me probably more commonly say Kohelet. Kohelet is the Hebrew title of the book, and so that's kind of where I go. Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiasticus literally translates to church document. So both of these are church documents. So it's really not particularly descriptive. So I will usually say, yeah, right. That's actually pretty good. It really is. Yeah, skeptical wisdom is sort of the personification of I don't know about that. Because you got Proverbs saying, hey, if you do good, you'll get rewarded. And you got Job saying, I don't know about that. Right? I mean, that's basically a pretty good qualification here. We're going to see some of the differences between them pretty soon. But anyway, yeah, Job and Ecclesiastes, Job and Kohelet are two really good examples of skeptical. Some people call it philosophical wisdom, which to me is, I don't know. That's well, they don't want to say skeptical, right? They don't want to. They don't want to sound. I think they use that term because it feels like skeptic has such a negative connotation with regard to biblical text. But yeah, Kohelet and Proverbs, the authors in Proverbs would not have gotten along. I mean, they would really have had their issues, and we're going to see that when we get into it. Some of the stuff that they directly are fighting about, without question. There are psalms that would fit in the category of wisdom, and I hesitate to say this. I will never forget James Crenshaw. He's at Duke. Really calling out Nancy Classy Walford. I doubt you're watching, Nancy, but I know we're friends on Facebook. Nancy is an exceptional psalm scholar. Even if she's not watching, I would say that. She's tremendous. She's sort of she went through the program about 10 years before me, very prolific author, expert in the Psalms, did a nice job. She was at a meeting and she was presenting on the wisdom Psalms. And James Crenshaw, whose expertise was wisdom, didn't believe wisdom Psalms existed. And so he still he asked her a question, and well, it's more of a comment than a question. That's sort of the academic way to call someone out. Well, I actually more of a comment than a question, and really called her out in that meeting. And to this day, I don't believe Nancy's ever forgiven him for this. And as a result, not an annual meeting goes by that when I see Nancy, I don't say, "Has anyone seen Crenshaw? Is he here this year? Did Crenshaw make the meeting?" Just because I've always been sort of like a little brother to her in the program, so that's what you do. So anyway, but even Crenshaw would agree that several psalms have strong wisdom elements. That there are elements in the psalms that sound very wisdomy. Psalm 1, 19, 37, 73, they all have the quality that you might expect in practical wisdom, where work hard, do good, follow the law, things will go well with you, right? The Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Is Psalm 1, classic two ways kind of. Most people talk about the two ways when they talk about practical wisdom. The way of life and the way that you want the good teacher and the harlot. In Proverbs you have those woman wisdom versus lady folly, that's a prostitute trying to seduce people. So the two ways that you find in these psalms might fit there. No one ever talks about this, and so this is a Dr. Wallace exclusive, I guess, but that I have seen. But I really think you could classify psalms like Psalm 88, and some others that are calling out to God, asking why. The 83s. Actually, most of them in book 3, now that we think about it, as they're struggling with the fairness of God. Even Psalm 89, you could argue, has some elements to it that might be like that. So I honestly think it's possible that it could fall into the camp of skeptical or philosophical wisdom, and I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility to say that. So, but the truth of the matter is, nobody can agree on what makes a wisdom psalm, because most people don't agree on what makes a lament psalm. A lament psalm has these elements. And if it has these elements, it's a lament psalm, right? It's kind of like, is this a country song or not? Well, when you listen to it, you can tell it's a country song. Wisdom psalms, they don't have that. Herman Gunkel actually put forward a number of things that he said believed he made a wisdom psalm, but Crenshaw rightly pointed out that if that's the case, Amos could fit into that category. I mean, some of the same elements that he saw making up wisdom psalms were making up some of the prophetic texts. So all of a sudden, if your categories are that big, then they're not meaningful anymore, right? So it's not helpful. But I could flip that around and say, okay, but there are five things that make a wisdom psalm, or excuse me, that make a lament psalm. And Psalm 88 only has two of them. But there's absolutely no question. Psalm 88 is a lament psalm, right? We know that. And so this is one of those. I think family resemblance, something like that, is a better way to think about it rather than qualifications. And I do believe there is such a thing as wisdom psalms, not just because I'm friends with Nancy, but I do. I may not think that all the psalms she thinks are wisdom psalms, but I do think that they are wisdom psalms. So we're not going to look at those directly, but I thought it was important to know that this is something that this literature is sort of pervasive in ways. You do find it, I think, in some prophetic teaching. You do find it in some um, Psalms. You find it and I would argue you find it in some New Testament traditions as well. That you hear people talking about these pithy ways of carrying on teachings. So calling them the wisdom Psalms, etc. It would be a modern taxonomy. It would be, Herman Gunkel. I mean, that kind of it, Herman Gunkel is, well, yeah.
Herman Gunkel?
Yes, he is in fact the Herman Gunkel. And if you would argue who is the most influential biblical scholar of the 20th century, his name would be Herman Gunkel. Um, it is he got kicked out of every decent. Well, nobody liked him. He got a job as an Old Testament professor, and he couldn't make any friends. Nobody in the biblical studies department would hang out with him. So he went. I'm just saying, no. He went and hung out with the. Are you going to play the Lonely Man theme from The Incredible Hulk all of a sudden? Nobody liked him. And so he ended up hanging out with the people that were studying Norse mythology. And they were the only department that I think that he could make friends in. I don't know why. Yes. Herman Gunkel made no friends, hung out with people in the Norse studies department, Norse mythology department. And as he watched what they were doing and they talked about what they were doing, he started thinking, wait a minute, that sort of thing kind of applies to what I'm doing. And so at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, he began applying the techniques that people were using to look at the origins of these Norse mythologies to the Psalms. And he began creating, he started noticing that there were these sort of um, shared qualities, characteristics, family resemblances. And he's the one that gave us the first sort of, this is a lament psalm, this is a praise, this is a hymn, this is a royal psalm, this is a creation psalm. He's the one who gave us all of those. And well, the reason I call him the most influential biblical scholar of the 20th century is because the people who disagree, he invented form criticism. And the people who disagree with him use his method to disagree with him. You've won the argument at that point. I mean, if they're using your method to tell you you're wrong, no, your conclusions are wrong when you say, well, you've won. So this is a completely modern approach to the Psalms. This is not the Church Fathers. You don't get this even in the Reformation. Nobody was thinking of the Psalms quite in that way. So this is a modern, I think, a helpful study. Now, the characteristics of wisdom material are probably most easily defined by thinking in terms of practical wisdom, because as I said, skeptical wisdom basically takes everything that we normally think of with practical wisdom and go, I don't know about that. So first of all, the doctrine of the two ways, which I've already mentioned, the way that leads to life, the way that leads to destruction. So if you get up early and you avoid hanging out with angry people and you don't try to hoard wealth, and then you can have a life that is a life of meaning. But if you are a lazy sluggard who's selfish and robbing people, well, that life's not going to go very well for you. And so that's the two ways: the way that leads to life, the way that leads to destruction. Deuteronomic theology is a phrase you're going to hear me say a lot when we're talking about wisdom literature, and we've talked about it before, but it's worth talking about again, I'm guessing. So Deuteronomic theology is the theology that comes primarily from Deuteronomy, but if you gave me that on a test, I would not give you credit for it. Deuteronomy is it's very common in the book of Deuteronomy that if you do what God says, it will go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. That's really the context of Deuteronomy. Follow the Torah, obey God, and it will go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you. If you don't, well, then destruction is coming. If you are disobedient, destruction is coming. And so what ends up happening is that this theology, good people get good things, bad people get bad things, becomes sort of pervasive in a number of places in the Old Testament. You see it in Deuteronomy, obviously. You also see it in what's called the Deuteronomic history, or the books that are edited together in exile to make sense of why they were in exile. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Those are called the Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic history. And they're called that because the stories in those books primarily follow Deuteronomic theology. The good people get good things. When you obey the Lord, it goes well with you. If you are the judges, if you are Joshua, if you are David, and if you are disobedient, then it goes bad for you. If you are the judges, or if you are Joshua, or if you are David, or any of the other kings in the history of Israel. So by and large, that theology is pervasive throughout those books. Practical wisdom, for the most part, now there are some exceptions in Proverbs, but for the most part, most of the Proverbs buy into that good people get good things, bad people don't get punished. That's just the way the life is. You work hard, you'll do well. You don't, you won't. Skeptical wisdom calls this directly into question. Ecclesiastes calls this into question. Job calls this into question. Both of those directly questioning whether or not the proverbist, the author of Proverbs, whoever those might be, and there's plenty of them, is right about that, because as they've seen the world, it doesn't work that way. So when you see the two ways, when you see Deuteronomic theology, that is one of those things people talk about to kind of quantify wisdom literature. So either advocating it or questioning it, I guess, would be the way to think about it.